and welcome to Viewpoint. The proposed conflict of interest bill has sparked a conflict of views between the government and the opposition. The legislation stems from the first recommendation made by Sir Peter Openshaw following the McGrail Inquiry. It seeks to place standards in public life on a statutory footing, covering the conduct of public officials, transparency in the declaration of interests, and the identification and management of conflicts of interest in public service. The government says the bill does exactly what it's intended to do. The opposition, however, has described it as toothless, arguing that it will allow abuses to continue. Tonight, I speak in depth to both the Chief Minister and the Leader of the Opposition about the key areas on which they disagree. Well, let me know what you think by emailing viewpoint@gbc.gi. We'll be hearing from GSD leader Keith Azopardi in part 2 of tonight's programme, but first, I went to number 6 Convent Place to speak to Chief Minister Fabian Picardo. Chief Minister, thank you for having me once again in the Cabinet Office. I'm going to take you through some aspects of the Conflicts of Interest Bill. We'll start with comparing it to the Canadian model because that has come up so much in the media. It was obviously a recommendation by Ian McGrail's lawyers that was mentioned in Sir Peter Openshaw's report as well. But the government has chosen to go with a model that more resembles the Westminster model. It's more principles-based. Can you tell us, though, in your words, why you think this is a stronger and more appropriate model for Gibraltar?
So perhaps we should just look at the analysis that you've done first, and then that might lead us perhaps to the right conclusion. The first reference to the Canadian model is made by Lloyd de Vicenzi in a recommendation he makes in conversation with the Attorney General, which is later reported to the inquiry in the context of the evidence given by Mr. de Vicenzi and the evidence given by the Attorney General. That's then adopted by Mr. McGrail's lawyers, who decide that this is what they would suggest to the inquiry should become the inquiry's own recommendation. The inquiry in the report of Sir Peter Openshaw says that Gibraltar should have a legislative scheme in relation to conflicts of interest, which should be something like the Canadian model or something which is bespoke. When deciding how to implement that particular recommendation, what we've done is we've gone to the person who would be described possibly as the top person in the United Kingdom to be able to draft such a model, who is the current Commissioner for Standards in the UK Parliament, who polices conflicts of interest in the context of the Westminster Parliament. And we've asked him to draft for us this recommendation in the context of a Canadian model or such other model as he might recommend is best. So the advice that the government has, not what the government has sought or what the government has said is best. The advice that the government has been given by the expert that we have contracted on behalf of all of us to implement this recommendation is that we should have not the Canadian legislative model itself, but a new legislative model which has got some of the principles contained in the Canadian approach, but is designed for what you might call a Westminster Gibraltar style system, and that has therefore inbuilt stronger provisions which are less prescriptive than the Canadian model. So what does that mean?
Yes, well, give me an example.
What does that mean? That means that the Canadian model tells you exactly what the situations that you might be in are and exactly how to deal with them. Whilst the model that we are being given is a model that is potentially even wider than the Canadian model, by telling you the principles that you have to apply and being less prescriptive on exactly when you have to apply them. So the question is, do you go for something that is very pointed and tells you when you have to act in a particular way, or do you go for something that is more principles-based and is therefore potentially wider and therefore more effective because it captures the substance of the behavior that you want to deal with, rather than just dealing with the form that the sort of behavior might manifest itself in?
Okay, well, Chief Minister, this is the thing. The Canadian model prohibits certain behaviours and actions, whereas, as you say, with the Gibraltar model, it's more principles-based. Yeah. So it's about declaring, being more transparent, and it's about managing conflicts. But The government has said the problem with overly restrictive rules is that it creates avoidance opportunities, but surely that's also the case with broad principles, because they also provide or create avoidance opportunities too, because they leave room for interpretation and discretion. And of course, those were areas, those grey areas were grey areas that Sir Peter Openshaw identified in the McGrail Inquiry.
Well, there were grey areas that Sir Peter Openshaw identified, and in my view, that was not what the inquiry was about. In my view, in certain instances, what was happening in the inquiry was that it was being turned into a political witch hunt by Mr. McGrail's lawyers, principally against me, perhaps others, but principally against me, failing to understand in the way that they were presenting the case for the purposes of seeking to be persuasive for their client, that indeed conflicts of interest had been very properly addressed in the context of what was happening there, because the decisions that were the subject of the issue of conflict were determined against those people who I might have been said to be holding a candle for or being a part of in the context of 36 North. So if you look at the issue of whether the behavior that you want to control is going to be prescriptive and that therefore people might find ways around it, or whether it's going to be in principle and people might find ways around it, you could possibly spend the rest of your life having an argument about that and still not take one view or the other. If you asked Keith Azopardi or you asked Mr. McGrail's lawyers, because the context of the inquiry was such as it was politically, they're always going to take the view that whatever the government says, they will say the opposite of. If you ask the government, we might say, well, look, our position was you don't need this conflict legislation. Let's be very clear and open about this. At the last general election, Mr. Azopardi was saying we needed this type of legislation. We were saying we didn't need this type of legislation. So instead of asking Mr. McGrail's lawyers, Mr. Azopardi, or indeed me and the government, let's ask somebody else. Let's go to somebody who is entirely independent. Let's go to the UK Parliamentary Commissioner, and let's let him determine whether it is better to go for acute instances, which might be avoided, or in principle provisions, which might, of course, nonetheless still be avoided. And the independent advice that we have is that because of the Nolan principles and the way that they apply to public life, which is what we want to see permeate how Gibraltar adopts this approach, the best way to do this is to take a principle-based approach set out in the legislation that he's drafted, which is legislation which, although whatever Mr. Azopardi may say, others are already looking at, even though it's early in draft, as potential models for much more developed, much bigger economies than our own.
There's a huge amount there to unpack. But first of all, I just want to stress that I'm going on Sir Peter Openshaw's recommendations. Yes, you mentioned a witch hunt by Mr. McGrail's lawyers, but I really want to just focus on Sir Peter Openshaw's recommendations. And having read the 700-page report, it's also the spirit behind that recommendation. And there were grey areas that he identified. For example, there were areas that both yourself and Sir Peter disagreed on as whether they presented a conflict of interest or not.
Yes, indeed.
And so the point that I'm trying to make is, shouldn't legislation that pinpoints exactly what is and isn't, would that not have been more helpful than one that just creates a broad ground where it's open to interpretation?
So let me unpack all that you've said in response to me. First of all, the witch hunt from Mr. McGrail's lawyers hasn't finished yet. It continues because they continue to use the McGrail Inquiry and bad-mouthing Gibraltar and its institutions in the self-promotion that they are doing even today. That process is one which I'm telling you was carried out during the course of the inquiry and, of course, informed the inquiry and its findings. The inquiry finding, if what you are saying, Ros, in the context of posing your question is, I'm going by the Openshaw recommendation, well then look, the Openshaw recommendation said the Canadian model or something else better suited, tailor-made for Gibraltar. When you get that, if you're acting in good faith, if you are not pursuing a witch hunt, which is simply to say anything which has been said about these issues in the inquiry, let's take the position contrary to the government. So if the government said no to the Canadian model, let's force feed the government of Gibraltar and its people the Canadian model. If you're not taking that witch hunty approach, then you go to an independent party and you say to that independent party, look at this report, warts and all, whichever side you were sitting on, there were warts in that report, right? And tell us what is best for Gibraltar, with no instructions that say we would like it not to be the Canadian model so that we win the argument in the end. We would like it to be the Canadian model so that we give up the ghost on the argument and we get over the issue. No, we just say, what is the best model? There's a recommendation, it should be the Canadian model or something better. What do you, and you, by the way, being the person who polices this for the mother of all parliaments, for the oldest democracy in the world, what do you think is the best model? And that is the recommendation. So, if I may say so, I think that the argument is settled by going to an independent individual to ask him for the advice and then acting upon that advice. And then asking that individual to come to Gibraltar to meet with all of the interested commercial parties and indeed with the leader of the opposition, so that you also understand what others think in Gibraltar, not just the government, when you produce your draft before publication. And then publishing the draft bill as a consultation document. Nobody replied in the consultation document saying it shouldn't be this model, it should be the Canadian model that the leader of the opposition is saying now. And in the way that you pose your question, I think you actually answer it. So, should you have, you said to me, instead, you said, a broad canvas? Well, actually, if you wanted to catch conflicts of interest, if you were genuine about that, if you were not getting yourself into the weeds of whether McGrail's lawyers were right, Picardo was right, Openshaw or Azopardi, if you wanted the right answer, you would actually want the broadest possible canvas, because then you would catch more potential conflicts of interest.
One final question on the bill, although the issue of the Canadian model will come up later on in my questions, but I do want to ask you, is this bill as drafted by Daniel Greenberg, or has the government had some sort of input or changed it in any way?
So the government has had very minor input. The minor input we have had has been based, ironically, on representations made to us principally by the founder of the GSD and the former chief minister, who is now not acting in his capacity as my lawyer in the McGrail Inquiry, but in his capacity as the person who runs the Law Society in Gibraltar, the Lawyers Regulatory Standards Authority, so that in the context of lawyers and in the context of people who are volunteers, different rules apply to them. So the changes that have been made do not relate to any of the issues which are in substance the subject of this debate between the opposition and the government. And I say it in that way because the opposition is picking this fight with the government. There's another government fight with the opposition, quite the opposite. It is,
well, they have to vote on the bill, so they have a right to express an opinion on it.
Of course, I would have thought that we would have been doing that in Parliament, not necessarily before we get to Parliament and before we have the debate on the bill. And of course, they're entitled to their view. But the surprising thing is that the issue they are taking is not with Fabian Picardo, it's not with Hassan's. I mean, Mr. Azopardi just wants to talk about Fabian Picardo and Hassan's because he thinks that's the whip that is going to win him the next general election, ironically not against Fabian Picardo. They're arguing against Daniel Greenberg. They're arguing about the person who is the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards in the UK today, who is looking at much more sophisticated issues of conflict and is, as a result, advising us in this respect. Now, this is why it's so important that I take you back to the first thing I said to you. How did the Canadian model come to be relevant? Because Lloyd de Vicenzi, in his evidence, said, look, I proposed to the Attorney General that he should think about a Canadian-style bill.
It is considered one of the most strongest in the Commonwealth.
Hang on a minute. Please, let me finish. Because it's important that I set out the context of the answer. Lloyd said, look, I proposed to the Attorney General he should look at the Canadian model because it's a good model that we might use in Gibraltar. Lloyd was educated in Canada. I've known him for many years. I visited him in Canada when he was a law student. That's why he's got this relevant connection to Canada. That comes into the mix in that sense. The Commissioner doesn't tell us that he's looked at any other model in the Commonwealth and decided which is stronger or not. Neither do we hear from Mr. McGrail's lawyers that they've looked at other models in the Commonwealth. That's why the Canadian model is mentioned. That's why so much stock is put by the Canadian model. When you send the recommendation of the Canadian model or a similar tailor-made alternative for Gibraltar to the expert, not to Ros, not to Keith, not to Fabian. I don't think any of us would argue that we are experts on UK parliamentary standards to the extent that Daniel Greenberg is, and none of us is a law draftsman. I'm definitely not. He tells us to do something else. So look, have the argument with him. Don't have the argument with me.
I'm just raising the point simply because it is...
I don't mean you. I mean,
no, I know, but I'm just raising the point because it is also said to be one of the strongest in the Commonwealth, and that is potentially why it's also being thrown into the mix.
Let me just ask you to pause there and allow me just to make this one point. The Canadian model, it may be one of the strongest in the Commonwealth until the Gibraltar model becomes law.
Why does this stronger then?
Because I think, and I am now being told, that actually our model is being looked at as being much better in the context of the application through legislation. This has not happened before. The application through legislation of the 7 principles of public life, right? Now, that's a big difference.
The Nolan
because
principles.
The United Kingdom has the code on the principles of public life. Gibraltar has the code on the principles of public life. But it doesn't have statutory footing for the principles. And what Daniel Greenberg is saying is this is the first time that the principles will be put into statutory footing, that there would be a legislative framework for the principles, and that's very powerful. And that may make our law actually a better model in some respects, because I don't know anything about Canada and what applies to them, but for some other Commonwealth countries or overseas territories than the Canadian model might be, which of course is designed for Canada and working in Canada as well as people there might determine it's working. I mean, I don't know whether there are voices against it in Canada.
Let's talk about the rules. You mentioned the word rules, and I want to ask you this because what we've seen in the legislation, this is primary legislation, but a lot of the rules, a lot of the guidance, a lot of the exemptions, they all come in secondary legislation.
Yeah.
And most of that is set by yourself and the Chief Minister. The Chief Minister and the Attorney General. So, you know, given that you retain so much power, the question is, you know, how much confidence can the public have in an independent act? Because you control a lot of the levers.
Yeah,
or whoever has your role.
Full confidence.
Full confidence.
Full confidence.
Explain why.
Because the position of the Chief Minister of Gibraltar has always enjoyed the full confidence of the people of Gibraltar, and it always should, whoever the Chief Minister may be. Look, you may have different political views to the Chief Minister. There are many people who have different political views to the Chief Minister. Every Monday, at this table, sit 9 people, all of whom have different political views. We come together around a particular decision because we're all individuals. But everyone has the confidence that the person who is elected Chief Minister of Gibraltar by the people is the person who enjoys the confidence of the vast majority of the Gibraltarians. Now, listen to what you're saying. What you're dealing with here are the rules to be made under the Act. Every single Act, every single statute in Gibraltar provides for rules to be made by the relevant minister, and sometimes by officials. This Act contains a rule-making power, just like every other act, and in this context, it's specifically the Chief Minister that makes the rules. In every other statute, it may be the Chief Minister or a relevant minister. Where a relevant minister is named, the Chief Minister can also make those rules. Of course, those rules are not going to be private. They're not going to be drafted by a Chief Minister. They're going to be drafted by draftsmen who will produce them to give effect to the Act in the way that is necessary, because a lot of this is, the minutiae of the law happens through rules. Those rules will then be signed by the Chief Minister into law. How can we, unless we start to entirely deconstruct the idea of hierarchical government, how can you challenge that people should or should not have confidence in a Chief Minister making rules?
Why shouldn't the Commissioner have ultimate control, the independent Commissioner? Why shouldn't they have ultimate control as to what rules are enacted and what aren't?
I don't think there's any model in the world that gives legislative power to an individual who is not an elected individual. And I don't think I could ever support that that should be the case. I mean, we have laws because we have a parliament. We have a parliament because people elect people to it. So for me, the idea that somebody who is not the elected representative of the people should be making laws is not one that would sit comfortably. I don't know whether there's any provision in our laws where the rules are made by somebody who is not elected, other than perhaps the Commissioner of Police, for example.
Let me put it crudely to you then. Let's say in future, not yourself, let's say in future there's a Chief Minister who decides to exempt bodies or officials, public officials, from the rules because it suits their purposes politically, let's say.
Yeah.
What's to stop that from happening?
General election.
So you'd have to wait 4 years for a general election?
Well, if you assume that he's done it on the first day after he's been elected, you'd have to wait 4 years. But it may be one of the things that people decide is why they no longer want to pack this person in a general election. That is the way that you deal with problems. That's how mature democracies deal with problems. That's how issues which relate to problems in other jurisdictions are dealt with. So, for example, let's look at the United Kingdom, where Mr. Johnson was himself in breach of parts of the ministerial code and couldn't be dealt with. Mr. Johnson, who was then convicted for breaching his own rules, and he was got rid of by his MPs under their system of government because they didn't believe he could any longer enjoy the confidence of the party and win a general election.
I don't really see that happening over here, though. It's a very different machinery over there.
Well, it might be in that respect, but you had to wait for a general election to get rid of the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom as a result of all of those things. Because be very clear about what you're saying. Are you suggesting there should be a way of getting rid of an elected official other than through a general election? Because that is dangerous. I mean, let's always remember what Winston Churchill said.
No, but
democracy is not perfect.
I'm talking about checks and balances, really, to ensure, so that you're not marking your own homework. Put it that way.
No, I don't think that you are marking your own homework. You are creating a new legislative model, which you have to justify to the public. But the product of government is the work of government. And the government is publishing and approving its own work. So if you're saying that we're approving our own homework, whenever we go to Parliament, these are our bills. And we vote for them because they are our bills. And we sometimes correct our own homework because we might change something in the context of a bill.
OK, the Commissioner needs to give a report at the end of the year to the Chief Minister. The Chief Minister then lays it in Parliament. Mm-hmm. Does the Chief Minister have the power to withhold, redact or omit anything from the report?
From memory, having looked at the Act, I don't think he does. But if, for example, the Chief Minister has powers in respect of other such reports, for example, when the Ombudsman provides a report, there is certain provision to redact things in the public interest. So it would not surprise me if that were not the case.
And what's your interpretation of as soon as practicable? Because there's no set deadline.
There's a legal definition of what practicable means. So it usually means as soon as you can after you have received it. I mean, the way that I've interpreted that is at the next available session of the Parliament. Sorry
to hark back to the Canadian Commissioner, but he does seem to have more power to sanction breaches than the Gibraltar Act. Would you agree on that? And why is that?
Well, look, the advice that we have is that the balance for Gibraltar is right under our legislation. I have not asked Mr. Greenberg to give less powers to the Commissioner in Gibraltar than in Canada. I've asked that we should be provided with an act that provides the right sort of balance. Now, if the Commissioner for Standards of the UK Parliament tells you that the level of power that he's given the Commissioner is the right level of power, then I would think that that is a good reason to follow his instinct and advice on it. We are not a nation of many millions of people with one of the largest geographies in the world, like Canada. Unfortunately, you might think, but that is the reality that we're dealing with.
Let's just go on talk about the rules and those guidance notes that are not being, I'm not aware they may have been drafted, but they haven't been published, put it that way. Are you expecting those to be published when the bill goes through Parliament, or will Parliament be asked to pass the bill without seeing the details in the rules?
The usual approach in the past 30 years that I have been in government, and indeed in the past 50 years that I have looked at of Gibraltar law, is that Parliament pass the Act and the rules follow later and the guidance notes follows later. There is never a situation where Parliament is given also the rules and the guidance notes. So I would expect that those would follow the implementation of the bill. And I haven't yet seen the draft of the rules or the guidance note.
Will you have any? Well, you're going to be setting them, so.
No, I'm not. Let's be very clear. This is one of the things that you need to, I think, factor into the way that you're posing these questions.
It says it in the bill, the draft bill. The rules will be set by the Chief Minister and the Attorney General.
Yes.
What does that mean then?
But this is what I'm telling you, you need to factor into the way that you're presenting the case. I am not going to sit down and say, right, now in the rules do A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. I'm going to be given the rules based on the principles set out in the legislation, and I'm going to sign them. So mine will be the power to sign them. Of course, when I look at them, if I think there's something wrong, I can influence them and I can ask that they be changed. But I am not going to be setting them or writing them myself. In all of the time that I have been in government, I have never taken pen to paper to write a piece of legislation or a rule, because I've taken the view that I am not here a lawyer, I am here a politician. And so lawyers will write those rules for the Chief Minister.
Can I just say, I think most people are aware of that. I think it's the influence of those rules.
I'm afraid you would be wrong to make that assumption, because there have been Chief Ministers who have taken their pen and drafted legislation themselves. I am not one of those.
But I'm going to jump, as we're talking about the rules, to exemptions, because there are exemptions of public bodies, public officials, exemptions to types of meetings that will be classified as official and not official. How are those decided?
So there will have to be those exemptions, because otherwise there may be meetings that should not be provided for in that way. There may be issues which relate to national security. The government of Gibraltar is not responsible for security, but it sometimes is involved in decisions that relate to security. There will be issues about civil contingencies and things that should be provided for in notes that are made but perhaps redacted in publication. And indeed, you've also got the possibility that there are people who would not be prepared to do the work that government needs them to do if they were not exempted from the provision. So let me give you an example that was put to us by the chairman of the GPA, the founder of the GSD, Mr. Monterifo, who said, look, you've got a very wide-ranging provision here, so why would people who volunteer to be on boards, who are going to make nothing from being on boards, but on whom the government relies, because they do a lot of work, whether it's on the parole board or on the GPA, etc., why would those people agree to be on the boards if they've got to disclose everything that they own or have ever owned, in exchange for giving the government many hours of their time free of charge for many weeks? So we agreed, contrary to the views of the perhaps leader of the GSD, with the founder of the GSD, that actually there should be an exemption for people who are volunteering. We agreed with the former leader of the GSD, in his capacity as the head of the LSRA, that actually the legal profession has to be exempted, because the legal profession has to be able to continue to be independent and not caught by government regulation of this sort. So they will self-regulate in the context of how the LSRA is run. So there are circumstances which are very bespoke and which have to be exempt from the type of legislation that we're talking about.
Chief Minister Fabian Picardo. Now, I put the GST's criticism directly to the Chief Minister, and we hear what the opposition leader also has to say. Will the GST vote in favour of the bill? Find out in part 2. And welcome back to Viewpoint. The opposition has been highly critical of the proposed conflict of interest bill, the first recommendation put forward by Sir Peter Openshaw in his report following the McGrail Inquiry. We'll be hearing from Keith Azopardi on why he believes the bill does not go far enough. But first, I put the GST's criticisms directly to the Chief Minister.
So let me put to you some of the opposition criticism. The GST says the proposed conflicts of interest law fails to include clear safeguards to prevent political favouritism in the awarding of high-value contracts and senior public appointments. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, there is no political preference in terms of the award of tenders or public appointments.
Some public might disagree with that.
Yes, of course.
It's the perception, don't forget, not just actual.
Look, people in Gibraltar will always have this perception that it's because of who you know rather than what you do, etc. Constantly. Even if it's all done at arm's length through the tender board, even if it's all done at arm's length through the PSC, somebody will find some relationship that they will say gives rise to this. It's nonsense. It's not happening. But we can keep talking about it, if you like. We can keep pretending that that's the case. Though my view is that the GSD's got it completely wrong, because this bill will actually deal with any reality that might produce such a result. And they're wrong not to see that.
What clause is that then?
Well, it's the operation of the whole thing. The whole thing is designed to ensure that you cannot have any of those circumstances appertaining as a result of the operation of the law, not that you needed the law in order to prevent those things from happening, because they were not happening.
Okay. The opposition argues the draft legislation contains no meaningful restrictions on ministers or senior public officials moving directly into publicly funded roles or contracts after leaving office, unlike the Canadian Act, actually, which has this cooling off period. What do you say to that?
I say that's not a conflict of interest point. That's a completely different point. That's a point about what is known as revolving doors, whether you can go from being in government to being in a public
Should that not be included?
Let me tell you very clearly, the only instance we have ever had of that related to the GSD. And the person who defended that that should happen, from memory, was Mr. Azopardi, who defended that Mr. Montiel should go from being a minister to being a civil servant, right? So if Mr. Azopardi thinks that he needs a law to stop him from doing that which the GSD were going to do, well, then perhaps if the GSD ever get back into government, they need to put handcuffs on themselves, because there are no circumstances such as that which pertain to the GSLP Liberals.
Okay, the GSD also compared the Conflicts of Interest Bill to the Anti-Corruption Authority Act, which it says was passed more than 3 years ago, but still not brought into force. Can you tell us when you expect this bill to go through Parliament?
The difficulty with the Anti-Corruption Act has been actually a change that we made in Parliament, which related to, from memory, and I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, no doubt, I think was at the suit of Mr. Clinton, and which I accepted, which is that the appointment of commissioners, etc., under the Corruption Act should be done by the SAC. The SAC then felt that they couldn't deal with the issue because of matters relating to how job descriptions were determined, etc. And we've had a bit of an issue about whether that needs to be amended because of the appointment. This is not a government delay issue. This has been a process-driven issue. It's unfortunate. It has taken time. I was very keen that we should have the Anti-Corruption Authority in place very quickly because, again, although I don't believe there's any political corruption in Gibraltar, people keep talking about this nonsensically.
It's the perception, as I'm saying.
Yes, of course it's the perception. But the perception, if it is entirely improper, just because people sit eating pipitas at Eastern Beach saying that there's corruption, doesn't mean that there's corruption. And that doesn't mean either that there is a reasonable perception of corruption,
no,
right? But look, I will tell you, Ros, I'm not for one moment blaming you for this. This has been going on for decades in Gibraltar. I mean, I remember sitting at Eastern Beach with my family eating pipitas and hearing things about governments long past, which were probably not true either. And it's just the gossip of the day. Now, you put in place a piece of legislation, you don't necessarily stop the thing if it is happening, and the fact is that it's probably not happening.
It's about safeguards, and Sir Peter Openshaw acknowledged that Gibraltar was a very small place, but he did criticise in his report meetings, unofficial meetings, where public interest matters were discussed, and I think it's about the safeguards to prevent not only conflicts of interest, but the appearance of conflicts of interest.
So look, I think that Sir Peter Openshaw failed to entirely understand Gibraltar, but you're right about what he said. And what he said is as true about Gibraltar as it is about the United Kingdom. We're just having issues now played out on the front page of today's Times, where the Prime Minister is alleged not to have kept notes of meetings, etc., in relation to the appointment of Peter Mandelson, where senior officials in the Foreign Office and in Downing Street are said not to have been keeping appointment notes in relation to Peter Mandelson and vetting in respect of UK security vetting. And these issues are the issues actually that arose in the Arms to Iraq inquiry, where it was found that the Tony Blair government was a little bit too far down the road of SOFA government, there weren't enough notes kept, etc., etc. Note-keeping, in my view, record-keeping is a very, very, very good thing. It must get better in the context of Gibraltar. It must get better in the context of the United Kingdom. And digital issues create problems because you have a lot of digital exchanges, email is kept, WhatsApps are not kept. These are issues that we do have to deal with. It's not just legislation that's going to help us on this.
Okay, and I do want to talk about meetings, but I must ask you first of all, once a conflict of interest is declared, how is that going to be managed?
Well, in the way that you have to manage them, and you must know how to manage them. I mean, I know that there is a suggestion that I didn't manage my conflict of interest well in the context of that inquiry. I think that's completely wrong. I think history will show that I managed my conflict of interest entirely properly, because the issue that arose in respect of 36 North was one that I did not handle by giving a contract to the people I had an interest with. However minor, however irrelevant, I handled it by saying I'm not even going to consider this, it's going to continue with the others.
But what about the meeting that you had with Mr Levy and Mr Levy's lawyers? It wasn't just the 36 North conflict of interest.
The last time I checked, meeting a friend is not an offence or a conflict of interest. Whatever any inquiry report might say, I will defend my right to meet you for a coffee on a Saturday and still be interviewed by you on a Monday, and you'll still be as tough on me on the Monday even if we have a coffee on the Saturday to talk about the Grand National.
But what if we were talking about a public interest matter? And what if I was more important than a GBC journalist?
We were not talking. There is nothing more important than a GBC journalist, than the road sweep, than the doctor, than the lawyer. Every citizen is just as important. It's a nonsense to think that I would ever see anybody as more important than the other, or a friend.
That's not the point, though.
No, hang on a minute, because it's important that we get to the bottom of it. And I'll say to you, as I said to the inquiry, I met James Levy and his lawyer, who happens to be one of my closest friends, right, on a Sunday in my house, and I said that I met them on a Sunday in my house to talk about the fact that James Levy didn't want to continue being the chairman of community care. That's what happened. Any conjecture about what else might have happened is wrong and untrue.
Isn't it a public interest matter? Isn't it a community care a public interest matter? And the whole issue is.
So let me just try and understand what you're saying, because I think we do stray into an area which would be very difficult to deal with. You're saying that if I meet somebody who tells me they no longer want to be the chairman of an independent charity, that is a public interest matter. And I say to you, if a friend says to you that they want to talk to you about an issue like that, it's not a public interest matter, it's a personal matter. But because the issue was relevant, because it involved James Levy and it involved me, I disclosed that we had had that meeting. I don't think there is absolutely anything wrong with that, or that I made any decision about that which was wrong. And if there is a finding which tangentially finds the contrary, I challenge it. Indeed, it is one of the things that you will know I'm challenging in my judicial review, because I believe you reported it very diligently, and it's contained in the grounds of review which are filed in the Supreme Court and are sub judice.
Chief Minister, the broad point I was trying to make was what constitutes an official meeting and what constitutes an unofficial meeting. So what constitutes public interest matter and what doesn't? Okay, the fact, let me just finish this question please, is the fact that in the bill, while it says people must declare who's meeting, what their role is and what action points were made, but it doesn't actually say you need to sort of minute the substantial points of the meeting itself.
But that's obvious, and it has to be done. And of course it has to be done, and that's what the bill provides for. Look, my view is that going forward under this bill, every meeting which involves a politician is a meeting that needs to be minuted. Any meeting that involves a public official will have to be minuted. Every meeting, unless there's a good reason why it should not be, will fall in the scope of the legislation. Do you realize what we're saying? I mean, that is a lot of meetings that are going to have to be properly minuted. It's going to create its own bureaucracy. But look, so be it. We're in a sophisticated world now. Gibraltar is a developed democracy. We need to have these notes. We need to make sure that we keep these records. But believe me, there is no attempt by the government to exclude meetings from that, although in certain instances it will be necessary to exclude meetings because of national security and other similar type issues.
Now, what we are hearing now in this interview is what we heard in the McGrail Inquiry, a difference of opinion. When there is a difference of opinion, when there is a disagreement as to what was what constitutes a conflict of interest, what constitutes public interest. Where does that resolution come? Who has the ultimate say?
Well, look, in the end, it will have to go through the hierarchy of decision-making in government. So in some instances, it will be the Chief Secretary, and ultimately will be the Chief Minister.
Okay. I do want to ask you...
You've got the Commissioner, who can disagree and can set out why he disagrees if something is brought to him.
Okay. I want to ask you, going back to the McGrail Inquiry, one issue that does come up, and it's an issue, actually, that concerns others as well, because like yourself, there are other lawyers who are partners in firms, and those firms make investments. In the Canadian structure, sorry to go on about that again, but they have a requirement where a senior public official have to have divestments or blind trusts, so that they're not aware of what investments are going in. You didn't know, according to yourself, that 36 North was a company that Hassan's had a share in, for example. Now, what mechanism is in place to ensure that future senior officials who are partnerships with companies who have shareholdings or, whatever, assets in areas that they don't particularly know about and therefore can't declare, what mechanism is in place to ensure that that's captured?
That's in effect a blind trust. So if you don't know that you have an interest in it, because the parties you have entrusted to make investments on your behalf have made it, then that is in effect a blind trust.
But shouldn't yourself, as a partner of a law firm that is making, I know that it's dormant, but of a law firm that is making investments all over Gibraltar, shouldn't that be divested?
So then you're arguing contrary to the Canadian model. You're saying that there should be just divestment, not blind trust. And as I understand it, you have the alternative under the Canadian model, which is to say you can do this through a blind trust, that you're not in any way going to favour one or the other options put before you because you don't know that you might have an interest in either of them, or you divest. Now, in the future, people might decide to divest in Gibraltar, or they may decide to go through the blind trust model, or indeed they may decide that, or there may be people who don't have any of those issues in play. But I think what's important is that people realize that this is not a bad thing. This is a good thing. This is investment in Gibraltar, which everybody should be wanting to see. Because the other alternative that you have is that you have Gibraltar entities who, instead of making investments in Gibraltar, decide to make investments outside of Gibraltar. That would not be a good thing for Gibraltar.
One final question on this, and then we move on very quickly. If a senior official is found to not have declared a conflict of interest or a personal interest in something, what happens?
So there can be sanctions, there can be different methods of dealing with that issue in the context of what is the hierarchy of the public service and how those issues of failing to comply with rules would be. Okay,
now the bill does not include government-owned companies. And I want to ask you why.
Well, because they're already part of the public sector.
Yes, but they get audited, the accounts get audited, but audits don't include conflicts of interest, and you're using, these government companies are fed with public monies as well.
Yes.
So could there not be conflicts of interest involved there?
Well,
a bill, if it was included in the bill, it would capture, which an audit doesn't capture.
So the government-held companies are all held through professional directorships that end up with both the financial secretary and the chief secretary, so they would be caught by that.
Conflicts of interest?
They control the corporate entities that control the government companies, and so therefore the government companies, in my view, it's wrong to say that they are not caught by this, because the individuals who run them as directors are, of course, governed by the rules.
Okay, and finally, just looking at a couple of Sir Peter Openshaw's recommendations, you have said already that the bill does implement Sir Peter Openshaw's recommendations, but Sir Peter's criticisms were often about judgment, inappropriate behaviour, improper behaviour, not just about transparency and recording details of meetings. So how would this bill prevent the sort of scenarios that he criticised in the McGrail Inquiry report?
Well, you know that those criticisms are the ones I think he got wrong, and that's why I've gone to the Supreme Court to challenge them in many instances. I think he didn't get it right in that respect. I mean, accepted the recommendations, but I think many of the findings were, for the reasons I've set out in the grounds of judicial review, not correct. But look, issues of judgment are issues of judgment. You know, I've been here for 15 years almost. I've got many judgments right and I've got many judgments wrong. And when it comes to politicians, people decide on balance at the general election whether they like their judgment or not. When it comes to public officials, because this is not just about politicians, when it comes to public officials also have judgments, some of which they get right, some of which they get wrong. In the end, find me one person that has got all judgments right all of the time. I would like to think that the leader of the opposition is not going to go into the next election pretending that he is the one who gets all of the judgments right compared to GSLP Liberal politicians who might get judgments wrong. I mean, there is a parable in the Bible about throwing the first stone that might be relevant to that analysis.
The Chief Minister speaking to me at length about the Conflict of Interest Bill. Let's hear now from the opposition leader. I put some of Mr Picardo's comments to Keith Azopardi and asked him whether the GSD intended to vote in favour of the bill.
Mr Azopardi, thank you very much for speaking to me. Now, there's been a lot of debate about the Conflict of Interest Bill. You've been very critical. You've said it lacks teeth. The Chief Minister has said the reason why he believes this model is stronger than the Canadian model, which has been spoken about, is because the Canadian model, he says, is perhaps too prescriptive, whereas this model incorporates broad principles, the broad principles of public life, which means that there is a greater scope to capture the behaviours it's intended to. Would you agree with that?
Well, no, I wouldn't. I mean, I think that is part inconvenience of the restrictions, to say that I don't like the prohibitions, and part superficial, because look, if you want to embody the 7 principles of public life in legislation, all you have to do is have a section that says so, and then reflect the Canadian model, which is more prescriptive and specifies what the restrictions actually are. What you've created is a toothless monster, as we've called it, because all it does is in half the bill, there's 46 sections in this bill, 23 are about creating new guidance, new rules, new regulations, but without telling you what the prohibitions actually are. The Canadian legislation is very simple. It has specific sections that tell you what you cannot do. And
Aren't those captured,
our legislation does not have those restrictions. And this is why I think it's inconvenient, because the government doesn't want to have those prohibitions. Because, as Mr. Picardo himself said in a GBC interview recently, this wasn't in their manifesto, it was in our manifesto. Having robust controls on corruption, abuse and waste and on conflicts of interest was in our manifesto. They're not interested in really controlling the issues that arise.
But Mr Azopardi, aren't those behaviours, isn't that conduct captured by the 7 principles, the Nolan principles?
Not unless you specify, not unless you then specify what you cannot do, because the 7 principles on public life, first of all, are already included in the ministerial code and so on, which by the way, is already there, but clearly is being breached as well already, even though it's there. But the principles do not create specific prohibitions. So what we're saying is, let's create those specific prohibitions. So when you leave government as a minister, you can't get a job or a consultancy with a government for a period of time, which is the Canadian restriction. Why don't we have restrictions in our law that say, if you are someone who is a minister or a public official or a party executive member of the current government, why is it that you are not either barred or restricted from the award of certain contracts? So that is all in the Canadian legislation. But can I say this, because I think it's important in terms of the approach. Our approach as GSD is not the Openshaw approach, because this did not start for us when Sir Peter Openshaw produced his report. We have been going on about the need to control conflicts of interest and abuse, waste and corruption since 2019, when we issued our commitments that are still live today, that there should be robust controls on these things in Gibraltar legislation. Sir Peter Openshaw has now produced his report many years after we set out our policy position. to some extent, that even the Canadian legislation does not go as far as we would go.
Okay, I do have a few things to pick you up on that, but the first thing I want to ask you about is you mentioned the fact that the rules and the guidance haven't yet been published. So you will be asked to vote on this bill without that. How will you be voting on this bill?
Well, we will consider our position. We will make clear what our position is on the bill, as we said in our press release. But it's very clear to us that this is insufficient, and therefore we cannot vote for it. It is insufficient. It does not meet the mark. It is inappropriate for Gibraltar. Our view is that this does not go far enough in any way, and therefore we are very concerned that all that this is lip service, total lip service, so that they can play to the gallery, pretend that they are implementing a framework for conflicts of interest, but in reality they have no commitment to do so. In some ways, the analogue to this, the true analogue, is what happened with the Anti-Corruption Act. I mean, let's be clear. In 2011, they went to the people of Gibraltar with a commitment to have anti-corruption legislation. It took them till January 2023 to introduce that legislation to Parliament. It still has not been commenced in 2026. We said it was a dead duck then, that it was not enough then, and not only is it not enough, it hasn't even been commenced. This is the lip service that the GSLP play on these issues.
I did put that to the Chief Minister. He said it was to do with process and not to do with political government or interference.
Well, I mean, there's always an excuse, whether it's process, because 15 years since they were elected. It took them till 12 years to even suggest the law that they were committed to since 2011. They haven't commenced it for 3.5 years since then. Well, and the reason I say it's the analogue is because this is a conflicts of interest bill that in half of it, 23 out of 46 sections, creates just rules that say, I'm going to have further rules, further regulations, further guidance. By the time you do all that, first of all, are you really going to do all that? But by the time you do all that, what are you creating?
Okay, but can we just rewind to my original question was, are you going to be voting for this bill? You said you'll have a good think about it, but it sounds as though you're going to be abstaining.
Well, we're not going to vote for it in the sense that we have concerns. We've made very clear what those concerns are. We are going to set out the issues of detail when we come to the parliamentary debate. I mean, this is an opportunity for me to again explain what those concerns are, but very clearly this bill does not control conflicts of interest. When you ask yourself the question, if I may, when you ask yourself the question, for example, just put it to the test, would this bill prevent the things that Sir Peter Openshaw had to consider? Would it prevent a 36 North taking, in other words, the company in which the Chief Minister had beneficial interest, would it prevent A36 North in the future having a government contract, taking a lucrative government contract? The answer to this is no.
The Chief Minister said he tackled that conflict of interest by ensuring that the contract remained with Gajero.
But hang on. Let's be clear what the Openshaw report says and what the evidence that the Chief Minister gave the police at the time says. It says that he had no objection to the investment by Hassans in 36 North, and he had no objection to 36 North taking the national security contract. This was a company in which he had a beneficial interest. He told the police he had no objection to 36 North taking that contract. That contract was worth to Blands in 2020, 2021, £1 million. It would have been worth the equivalent to 36 North. So this is a Chief Minister who says he had no objection to 36 North, the company in which he had a beneficial interest, taking the contract, had they agreed to take the contract in a smooth way. The only reason that he then said that Blands should continue is because they could not agree terms. So when you ask yourself the question, would this legislation, you go back to that, would this legislation prevent a 36 North happening? The answer is no. Would GSD legislation prevent it? Absolutely. And would the Canadian legislation prevent it? Yes. And that is why this legislation is poor. It doesn't meet the mark. It's lip service to the reality. It is not about controlling the excesses that we have seen in the past.
Mr. Azopardi, why did you not put your concerns down when there was the consultation process?
Because it was very clear to me in the consultation process. We had a private meeting, but I'm not going to discuss what I said or didn't say in that consultation process. It became very clear to me immediately that this was not a bill that was going to meet the mark. And John, I'm not negotiating the process in a bona fide way with a government that I do not believe has a real commitment to reform. We do not believe, as GSD, that there will be change.
Isn't it your role, though? You are the opposition. You have concerns about this bill. Surely it's an obligation to make those concerns known.
I will make my concerns known. I have been making my concerns known publicly. I will make my concerns known when the bill arrives for debate in Parliament. That is the proper forum for me to make my detailed issues clear. Look, this fundamentally, we're dealing with a government that is not committed to these issues of reform. It's not committed. We've been talking about it since 2019. We issued a policy paper in 2019. If they were committed, they take it on board and have done something 7 years later since we said it. Because as Fabian said in his interview a couple of weeks ago, this wasn't in their manifesto, it was in ours. They're not committed. They're paying lip service to the anti-corruption legislation. They're paying lip service to the Openshaw recommendation. They're not going far enough. Look, if they really wanted to do something about these things, they would not award a contract to a company within which one of its election agents has beneficial interests. So they do not even recognize that there are conflicts of interest in this situation. We want to prohibit it. They want to tolerate excesses. We want to ban them.
First of all, let me just ask you, why are you talking about the Canadian model? Because, of course, this was brought up in the Openshaw inquiry by Mr. McGrail's lawyer after it was raised by Lloyd de Vincenzi. So why have you latched onto it?
Well, look, the Canadian model I'm responding to it because it is part of the Openshaw recommendations to look at the Canadian model or any other appropriate model. The Canadian model happens to be a fairly good model that creates restrictions, but in some ways, the Canadian model itself does not go far enough in terms of what the GSD wants. So I'll give you an example. We think, we've been saying this for 7 years already, that the legislation should create two bags, a bag of prohibited individuals and a bag of restricted individuals. And so prohibited individuals could be, for example, family members of a minister that should really not be awarded a particular contract if you're in government. Someone who should be restricted perhaps is someone who's a party member or a party executive member. But the point, sorry, if I just finish the point. Mm-hmm. The point is that this legislation that the government has put forward does not go far enough. The Canadian legislation is better. It is the model that I think should be looked at, but even there, we should go further to make sure that the excesses of the past do not happen again. That what people know is happening in Gibraltar does not happen again.
Okay, so being that Gibraltar is a very, very small place, you said about family members should not be able to, I don't know, put in a tender or whatever. But then you could also argue, why should somebody who's got nothing to do with the government not be allowed to put forward a tender legitimately?
Well, look, I mean, I think that you can be in government.
That's the problem with when you have prescriptive
well, look, you can take the view. I take the view that you need to be clear about the prohibitions because otherwise these excesses happen. I don't think it's acceptable as a matter of principle for there to be a company within which a minister or a chief minister has an interest that can be awarded a public contract. That was Mr. Picardo's evidence to the RGP, and it was reflected in the Openshaw report. I think, as a matter of principle, that's wrong, and it should be prohibited clearly and restricted. You can either be in government or you can be in business with the government, but you can't be in both. You can't be in government doing business with the government and benefiting from your position either because you're a minister or someone closely connected to the political party in government. I think it's totally unacceptable. And I think in Gibraltar we need to turn the page. We've been talking about this for 7 years. We've now had the Openshaw report. It's an opportunity to turn the page. This legislation is not that opportunity because it will not do it.
I did put some of the GST's criticism to the Chief Minister, the first one being that you said the proposed conflicts of interest fail to exclude clear safeguards to prevent political favouritism in the awarding of high-value contracts and senior public appointments, something that you've just been touching on. Chief Minister said there is no political preference in the award of tenders. The bill is designed to prevent these things from happening.
Well, it doesn't do that. I mean, I challenge anyone to pick up this. I mean, this is all nonsense from Mr. Picardo. You're not going to get change from this government, whoever the leader is. That's the reality. This is nonsense. I challenge anybody to pick up the bill and tell me where the restrictions are. For half the bill, what you're creating is mechanisms to create further rules and regulations and guidance. You're not telling me what the restrictions are. If you put it alongside the Canadian model, although there are others, there are very clear restrictions on the prohibition of contracts or jobs, the divestment of interests, the declaration of very specific interests, the prohibition of certain activities, of taking specific gifts, or even private travel in private planes. That's not in our bill. That's the reality.
So, regarding the lack of provisions for a cooling-off period, which is something that you said, the Chief Minister said the only instance that ever happened was when Keith Azopardi defended a minister becoming a civil servant. There are no instances or circumstances that pertain to the GSLP Liberals.
And in that particular case was which one? Because I can't
Mr.
remember.
Montiel, he said.
Well, I mean, that's completely false. It's completely false. Because as Fabian knows, I acted for the government. I acted for the government in that case. I didn't act for Mr. Montiel. No, Mr. Montiel had separate representation from Hassan's, by the way. So I'm not even, I mean, if we're into the game of falsehoods, I mean, that's an obvious falsehood. I represented the Chief Secretary in that case.
Okay, the other issue that's come up, is the issue of government-held companies that are not captured by this bill. The Chief Minister said that the senior officials who run them as directors are governed by the rules. So doesn't that make that okay?
Well, I don't see that. I mean, I think there's no explicit clarity in this bill in terms of restrictions. You know, and when you go back to the revolving door question, I mean, it's clear, surely, that there is a revolving door and there are no restrictions. I mean, you've got, for example, former GSLP ministers in accepting engagements to act for the government immediately. So there's a revolving door of you finish being a minister one day and you turn up tomorrow precisely acting for the government. The Canadian legislation prohibits that. It at least provides a cooling off period on that. Mr. Montiel's case, by the way, was not a revolving door case. It was a completely different argument based on a claim that he had. The revolving door prohibition is about engagements.
Mr. Azopardi, I'm going to put to you the same question that I put to Mr. Picardo, in that this conflicts of interest bill is not just about what it says on the tin, it's about what's inside. Are you saying then that you do not believe that it answers the call from Sir Peter Openshaw in his recommendations?
I'm saying that if you look at the Openshaw report, and it's about the inability of the Chief Minister to navigate his conflicts of interest with the senior partner of Hassan's, it's about the fact that he found that the Chief Minister had attempted in a grossly improper way to interfere in a criminal investigation. The whole ethos running through that is the inability to navigate conflicts of interest. If you want to have robust conflicts of interest legislation, therefore, irrespective of what model you look at, it needs to do what it says on the tin, which is to prevent the excesses of the past. This would not prevent a company in which the Chief Minister has an interest, A36 North, getting a lucrative contract worth millions. It would not prevent it in the future. It would not prevent a party executive member getting a lucrative contract. like this government has awarded. It would not prevent that in future. So when you step back from all that, what we're saying is that this creates a much bigger issue. And the much bigger issue is that this is just symptomatic of a government that tells you one thing and does another, that tells you that it's been vindicated and exonerated and then files a private legal challenge of the chief minister because it knows in reality it hasn't been vindicated or exonerated. This is a government that has no commitment to reform, the reforms that Gibraltar needs, and that will not come irrespective of who leads the GSLP at the next election.
I'm completely satisfied that the bill that we now have is designed by the United Kingdom's foremost expert on this matter, Daniel Greenberg, the UK Commissioner for Standards, to bring into a legislative framework the 7 principles of public life and put them for the first time in the United Kingdom and in the Commonwealth on a statutory footing. These principles will now be the law. That is what I think makes this a commendable piece of legislation. That's why I've agreed to it, because it implements the recommendation of Sir Peter Openshaw and is not just the idea that we need to have a conflict of interest bill. This goes further, and this is where I think the opposition is wrong. This doesn't just do what the recommendation provides. It doesn't just do what it says on the tin. It actually brings principles into statute and is much wider in its ambit. So I very much look forward to this becoming a piece of legislation that will govern our public life for many years to come, and I think will become a model for many more common law jurisdictions going forward.
Chief Minister, thank you very much for speaking to me. Thank you very much.
The proposed conflict of interest bill continues to divide opinion, with the government arguing it will strengthen standards in public life and the opposition maintaining that it does not go far enough. As the legislation makes its way through Parliament, the debate over transparency, accountability and public trust is likely to continue. Let us know where you stand. You can email your views to viewpoint@gbc.gi. Thank you for watching. Good night.